Okay. Hello. I think we're ready to get started. Good morning. Welcome to the Board of Commissioners Informational Board Briefing. The health and safety of our community and staff members are at the forefront of our minds as we continue to navigate county business in light of the COVID pandemic. Today's meeting is a hybrid board meeting. Some presenters and guests will appear in person and some will appear virtually. For those appearing virtually, please mute your mic when not speaking. And when presenting, make sure to unmute your mic and turn on your camera. For all presenters, please state your name for the record before speaking or responding to questions. Today's first briefing is on the 2020-2021 Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act funding for direct business relief grants. So we will start, or we are not starting with that?
Yep.
Right. John?
Thank you, Commissioner Myron, and Commissioners, and the other commissioners. I was about to list everybody, but yeah. Thank you so much. My name is John Waszczyński, and normally I come to you as the Sustainability Director, but today I'm hopefully coming to you really as the last time as the COVID-19 Business Economic Relief and Recovery Coordinator. That was my moonlight position throughout the pandemic. I'm hoping that position or that role for me won't be necessary anymore, but you know, who knows? We're gonna have a COVID briefing after this, so maybe we'll find out more. So I am going to be just kind of giving a breakdown of the 2 rounds of CARES Act funding that the county got from the state, provide a little bit of detail about how those funding decisions were made, and then also, sorry, I'm just trying to advance my slides here. Oh, can I have the next slide, please? So I'll just give you a little bit of context about how we made decisions, you know, what information we were looking at, talk about the 2 rounds of funding separately. I'm going to have my coworker here, the wonderful Jeff Martin from the Health Department, talk about some of the grants that went directly to restaurants and businesses. And then we have 2 wonderful partners of ours, Miso and Paco, and they're going to share some more stories about how this funding actually impacted businesses. So I suspect my portion of this presentation will be a little bit more boring, but as it will have some wonderful context from our partner organizations. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we got 2 rounds of funding. So you're roughly, you know, $12.5 million. And the state gave us some direction on how they wanted those dollars allocated. So they wanted to prioritize smaller businesses, rural businesses, and businesses that were owned by people who identified as people of color. And then one important note is that there was this CARES Act mandate that administrative costs, one had to be direct administrative costs, and then they also had to be capped at 5%. And I'll talk a little bit about how that impacted some of our decision making as we go along. Next slide, please. So we wanted to, you know, of course, as we were making funding allocations and designing the program, ensure that we were, you know, following applicable laws. We of course wanted to bring our county values to bear on these decisions. Use data when it was available. This is particularly important, looking at the public health data and looking how COVID was impacting different communities. I'm sure this is something you all have a PhD in public health now, so I'm sure you are all looking at these data very closely. We looked at existing partnerships and leveraged those were available. And of course, the chair wanted us to move quickly because businesses were hurting and getting the money out to the businesses was the most kind of important thing to do. Next slide, please. So I highlighted these two dates here on this jobs graph from the state of Oregon. So the reason I chose November 2020 and November 2021, because that was roughly when the money was going out to the various businesses through these grant processes that I'm going to be talking about. November 2020 was a particularly unsettled time. As you'll recall, we really didn't know what was happening with the pandemic at that time. I think we were just hearing about vaccines for certain populations. There was, of course, a lot going on politically at the federal level at that time, as you'll recall. It was in the business cycle, I think, a pretty unsettled time. We saw that sort of temporary drop in employment. So we were talking about the K-shaped recovery and other kind of factors at that point. Next slide, please. Another factor that went into our decision making was that the CARES Act really prioritized certain cities over others. And so we saw the vast majority of funding go to the city of Portland for the CARES Act. So as we were thinking about designing our programs, we wanted to make sure that we were providing emphasis and priority to East County cities so that there'd be a little bit more parity in how these dollars were distributed. Next slide, please. And of course, we had a really strong emphasis on equity. I was reading an article yesterday in the Washington Post, and it highlighted that in the beginning part of the pandemic, Black-owned businesses closed at twice the rate as white-owned businesses, with almost over 40% of Black-owned businesses closing during the pandemic. Fortunately, there's been a rebound nationally, but it kind of gives you a sense of where our minds were at when we were looking at the landscape and thinking about how we can deploy these dollars really to try to not just help any business, but to try to focus on those businesses that were being most impacted. Next slide, please. And of course, we talked a lot to businesses directly. We talked to, this was sort of the height of my moonlighting period. And, we were on the phone with business associations that were, kind of industry specific, restaurant or retail type associations. Some of them sprang up during the pandemic in response to the pandemic. We also talked to individual businesses to really, and then of course business associations to really get a sense for what was happening on the ground and how some of the public health measures that were put in place to slow the spread of COVID were having a really serious impact on the ability of businesses to stay afloat. Next slide, please. Okay, so that brings us to round one. This was a kind of extraordinary time. The governor's office issued a press release on November 17th saying that counties were going to get CARES Act funding to make grants to businesses. That's when we heard about the fact that the county would be getting the $7.5 million. The money had to be spent by December 31st of that same year. So it offered us a very compressed timeline under which to spend $7.5 million. We kind of compared it to an old movie called Brewster's Millions, where he had to spend all this money really quickly in order to gain his inheritance. So we had this really compressed time window. Fortunately, there was some partnerships waiting in the wings that we could take advantage of. Prosper Portland had earlier in the year issued some block grants with various community-based organizations and community chambers of commerce. You'll hear from Paco later, one of our community chamber partners. And we were able to utilize those partnerships that Prosper had established And since they had gone out and done a round of grant making already, what we were able to do was give those organizations that had done that grant making more dollars so they could go reach into their list and either give additional funding to businesses that needed additional funding or reach deeper into their grant lists to fund more businesses. The other route that we did, I mentioned this prioritization of East County. We were able to create very quickly a partnership with the Portland Business Association charitable arm, that their nonprofit, and set up a grant making process for East County cities. And with the PBA, we established a steering committee of local elected leaders, and Commissioner Stegman was really pivotal in helping to get that coalition off the ground and to spread the word that these fundings were available and get those out. And of course, and this is what Jeff will talk about in a moment, we were able to do a lot of grant making directly to businesses that are licensed by Multnomah County. Next slide, please. So here's how the funds were divided up. You can see the community-based organizations and community chambers of commerce. And really, these were sort of catch as catch can. Some of the chambers, just didn't have capacity to work with us in this initial round, but some of them were able to, thank goodness. And we were able to get the dollars out. But the majority of the dollars, you can see, went as small grants to restaurants. So I'm going to, next slide, please. I think this is going to be Jeff's time to shine. Jeff, take it over.
Good morning, commissioners. My name is Jeff Martin. I'm work for Multnomah County Health Department in their Environmental Health Services program. During this time, it was quite interesting for the food service industry. During that time, we were back to phases. So when each county had a different phase that they were going to operate in, and it was based off the numbers of COVID positivity rates as well as hospitalization. So every week, our restaurants and mobile units were waiting to see what phase we would going to be in from week to week to week. And those phases would dictate whether they were allowed to have indoor dining, outdoor dining, and how many people they could actually even have in their restaurants. So, operating a business from week to week becomes quite stressful on them. So every month through 2020 and 2021, our office was meeting with our Food Service Advisory Committee, which is made up of restaurant operators throughout the committee, as well as mobile unit operators. And we kept on asking them, what exactly do you need from us to make things a little bit easier as you're trying to operate a business during a pandemic? And one of the things they kept on mentioning to us was, please make something easy and basic that we don't have to have a CPA fill out a grant paperwork application for, because there were many other opportunities. But what we've heard from the federal government, those applications they were extremely time consuming. And these were small mom pop facilities that did not have the resources to have a CPA invest into reviewing their application and submitting their application for them. So with that in mind, we took that into consideration as we started hearing word that we may be able to provide money directly to our licensees. To set the stage a little bit more, on November 11th of 2020, we were identified as one of the counties that were going to have a 2-week pause. And what that meant was that you could only have 50 people inside a facility. And so that includes staff. So again, most operations have, about 10 people working for them. And then, you could only have about 40 customers in place. But again, if they only had room for those 40 customers, because again, they had to do 6-foot spacing from table to table and from their other coworkers. At the same time, this applied to mobile units as well. So some weren't able to operate because you couldn't have 6 feet distance in between each other. So they're constantly struggling. How could they operate best during this time? On November 18th, that's when we had a statewide freeze. And that's when there was no longer allowed to have indoor dining at all, either whether it was if you had the spacing or not. They basically were kept on rolling back the restrictions as the cases were going up more and more. And in Multnomah County alone, we had our cases, triple that during that time period. So it was just getting worse and worse. So, that's at the end of the month, we found out we were able to provide money. And so we were able to pull together a quick Google form where you had the basic questions that you could answer. And again, going back to figuring out how we could get money to those small mom and pop businesses that didn't have the resources of a CPA on staff. So we were able to identify, businesses that had 5 or fewer permits within the county, as well as that they were Oregon-based, so we could make sure the money was going directly to the facilities that were serving the community. So on November 30th, we sent out an email to all of our operators. So there's about 5,000 people that got this email, letting them know that this was available to them. And within the first hour, we had 266 responses requesting money. And by the end of the day, the email went out at 11 o'clock in the morning. We had 1,052 requests for support from the county. And at the end of the day, we were able to process around 2,800 applications. Those were based on making sure that they met those criteria of having 5 or fewer, as well as being an Oregon-based. The impact of the grant, again, it was less than $2,000 everyone got, and it ranged from mobile units to restaurants. But again, the impact was quite big for the community. The amount of emails that we got thanking us for being able to, pay the electric bill, which is quite expensive for if you run a restaurant, your electric bill can routinely go close to $2,000. Having this extra money and resources to offset some of those basic utilities, any licensing or permitting that they needed to do to continue to operate, as well as to ensure that they can pay staff was hugely beneficial to them. And we got hundreds of emails thanking us that we were able to provide this basic level of support and at the end when the vaccine was just coming out and there was a light at the end of the tunnel for them.
Thank you, Jeff. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about data for round 1. I'm not going to include the information from Jeff's program, those 2,000 plus restaurants that received grants. We just didn't have a lot of data, but these are the grants that went out through our CBO partners and our community chambers. And you can see here the distribution, the size of the circle is commensurate with the size of the grant. And we had a grant cap of $25,000. And the neighborhood is sort of this darker orange color if it got more grants. And so you can see we really did do a good job succeeding in making sure those funds went out to those East County communities. But obviously there was still a huge number of grants occurring within the main commercial areas of Portland as well. Next slide, please. Here is a breakdown of those grants by industry type. I've highlighted the sort of the top 5 industry types here, and you really see that restaurants and cafes and food carts did get a lot of assistance, and that's not surprising, again, given all those challenges that Jeff highlighted a moment ago. This was an incredibly difficult period for restaurants, and it was really difficult to have those conversations directly with restaurants providers because they were extremely frustrated with the fluctuation in public health guidelines and really not knowing what was going to come next in terms of the challenges that they would have to face. Next slide, please. Here's a breakdown along gender lines, and you can see sort of a fairly balanced representation of gender distribution, but obviously the majority going to female-owned businesses. Next slide, please. And here we have by racial and ethnic distribution. And I think one of the giant benefits we had from working with organizations like the Community Chambers of Commerce, Apano, NEA, and in the next round, Hacienda, was that we were able to reach much more deeply into communities of color, because those are relationships that we don't typically have directly with businesses as Multnomah County, with the exception of our licensing programs. And so being able to lean on those relationships that those organizations had was really important. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears, talk about the next round. So there was Jeff mentioned that we had these sort of levels that the state would put us, each county into, these sort of more or less restrictive levels. There was a 1 week where Multnomah County got stuck back into the high risk category, and that was right before the state changed their approach and got rid of the high, medium, low risk categories. But that 1 week, you know, we snapped back and people kind of freaked out in the business community because they were, you know, really introduced that high level of uncertainty again. And to help sort of ameliorate that a little bit, the state gave us this second round of CARES funding that was going to, you know, help to address some of that for those high risk counties that got snapped into that for a week. At this point, Congress had amended the CARES Act. It's extended it for a second year. And President Trump signed the bill. There was a little bit of uncertainty for a moment whether or not he was actually going to sign the bill. But this did give us until December 31st, 2021. I'm sorry, December 1st, 2021, to spend these dollars. So with that additional time, that allowed us to be a little bit more thoughtful. We went back to our community partners once again to see if they'd be willing to work with us for the second round. And they were, again, thankfully. And so that was a big relief, and more of them were able to work with us than previously. I'll talk about all those organizations in a second. I think there was one big barrier, and I mentioned earlier that there was this 5% direct administrative cost gap. And, you know, it essentially cost those organizations more money to get these grants out than they would be able to reimburse themselves for. Fortunately, we have an amazing board of county commissioners, and you allocated additional dollars, $200,000 roughly, to help provide that additional 5% indirect administrative costs for each of those organizations. And I think that made a huge difference in our ability to get these dollars out the door. Again, we wanted to focus on minority-owned businesses. We wanted to look at loan forgiveness this round through our partner MISO, and Beth will talk about that in a moment. We're hearing a lot about commercial rent relief. A lot of landlords had allowed their tenants to, you know, forego paying rent. That didn't mean they forgot about the past due rent. So that was a huge issue at the time that we're hearing a lot about. And each of these organizations did a full brand new round of grant making. And, you know, in addition to additional points for people of color owned businesses, we also asked them to prioritize East County businesses. Next slide, please. Here's the breakdown of funding and the number of grants that each organization made. You can see that NAIA and ONAC worked together, kind of teamed up for their round of funding. That's why they're combined there. But these are the grant totals. And again, we were looking when making these decisions at the burden of disease in various groups within the community. Next slide, please. So just a quick note, I was not able to get a geographic kind of breakdown map for round two. I will get that, and I'll share it with everyone on the board as soon as it's ready, but I just kind of got backed up in the queue with our GIS team and wasn't able to get it in time. So my apologies for that. But I will make sure that you have that so we can kind of see that distribution across the county's geography. Again, you can see a little bit more of a distribution across a lot of different sectors here, industry sectors this time around. So a little bit more balanced in terms of what industries we're getting grants. Next slide, please. Here we see the gender breakdown again. Next slide, please. And the racial and ethnic breakdown. And again, you can see a strong proportion of grants going to businesses of color. Next slide, please. This is just, there's a couple slides here. These are just comparing rounds 1 and 2. It's a little difficult to compare rounds 1 and 2 because, again, we had fewer data for the restaurant component, which was really made up the majority of spending. And here, again, is that comparison by gender. And next slide, please. Oh, a little bit more comparison. Sorry, I thought I deleted these slides, but okay, next slide, please. Okay, so before we bring up our invited speakers, I just wanted to give a lot of thanks to a lot of people because you see my smiling face up here today, but I probably did the least work. So Nicole Buchanan has been a thought partner and a doer throughout the entire process. So huge thanks to Nicole. Rebecca, as I mentioned, was a huge, from Commissioner Stegman's office, was a huge partner in the initial round of funding when it came to setting up that East County process under very short timelines. Eric Aranya's office was, a constant partner and guide throughout this whole process. Health department staff, Jeff did a lot of work, but of course had a whole team backing him up. The environmental health team, the inspectors, the front office staff all did a huge amount of work. Contracting team, I know that you all know it takes a while to get a contract, through our process here at Multnomah County, but Heidi and Maura did an incredible amount of work to expedite those contracts and make sure that we got them in place, and all the T's were crossed and the I's were dotted. And then Ben Harper, GIS Wiz, did that beautiful map that we saw earlier. And like I said, I'll give you the round 2 map in short order. Okay. And now I'm going to invite up Beth and Jan. And Jan, I'm going to ask you to go first and talk about something about.
Thank you, John. Good morning, Commissioners Marin, Jayapal, Vega Peterson, and Stegman. Thank you. My name is, for the record, Janice Mason, and it would help to put on my glasses. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a Filipino American working in Portland, Oregon for more than 22 years. I currently serve as the president of the Filipino American, I currently serve as a volunteer president of the Filipino American Chamber of Commerce. But I'm here present today wearing the hat as co-chair of the Community Chamber Coalition, founded of culturally responsive business chambers in our community, namely the Black American Chamber of Commerce, Hispanic Metropolitan Chamber, Oregon Native American Chamber, and Filipino American Chamber. I also want to acknowledge in the audience Carmen Castro, who is the executive director of the Hispanic Metropolitan Chamber. Also here is staff from PACO, newly hired Joselito Tenega. Both experience and data show that the result of inequitable systems and economic development practices, minority business enterprises often lack the resources, technical knowledge, relationships, and access to capital required to reach their potential. I did have some slides. I'm wondering if we can pull up the PowerPoint. Thank you.
Yes.
That's the one. Yes, thank you. And
And
you can go to slide 2. Thank you. So in May of 2021, the county connected with our members of the coalition to discuss partnering and distributing of business relief resources. As John pointed out, we participated in round 1, and we're also working together with Prosper Portland, providing technical assistance and providing services for businesses. These funds were intended to provide relief for business impacted by the health restrictions. And so providing complementary services with the TA, technical assistance with Prosper, as well as the cash grant funding was really a welcome relief for our small businesses. The coalition members focused on historically underfunded and overlooked communities. And we will show you some of that data here in a second. Next slide. As a result of our combined efforts, the state allocated as well as the general funding that you all allocated for administration, we dispersed the state, following the state requirements of pursuing businesses with fewer than 100 employees, businesses in rural, identify those businesses that identify as minority-owned, women-owned, service-disabled, veteran-owned, and emerging small businesses. With these grants, they range from $2,000 to $25,000, which provided economic relief to support. And as illustrated here, our combined efforts together with NIA, we had 846 applicants, 460 total awardees, and dispersed and distributed $2,745,000. Next slide, please. So in the remaining slides, I'll quickly walk through some of the data. I know it's going to be a little bit hard to read, but you will have a copy. And it shows our findings of the applicants and awardees collectively. We will also provide the raw data to your staff, but we'll just talk about a few highlights here. Next slide. So at the top of all of the slides that you'll see that we'll show here, the top portion is the applicants, the number of applicants, and then the data for the awardees. So as mentioned, we received 846 applications and we awarded over 400 businesses cash grants. And this is just highlights some of the features. You'll see the code there for the various organizations and the various chambers. Next slide. We also collected gender information about our awardees. As similar to John showed, the majority we found were women-owned businesses. Next slide. This was interesting. I know it's hard to read, but the zip codes throughout the county and the reach that we had, and what we found with this analysis is that with just 2 of our chambers, we were able to reach a cross section of zip codes, and the other chambers reached alternatively another side of the county. So every part of the county was really touched by or reached with businesses that were throughout. So we did have an emphasis on East County and it paid close to attention to those areas especially. Next slide. Again, industry was wide and varied. Similar results. Restaurants were high on the list, personal services, as well as bars and, sole proprietors in various, just a variety of industries. Next slide. We also asked about their length of time in business and got details about their outlook, how long they had been in business. And you'll notice in the second column, many of the 4 to 6 years and 7 years and above, and then more than 10 is the last column on the right. But many were in the under 7 years category as far as awardees. Next slide. We also looked at operations if they were currently open. As highlighted, this application opening was during the fall and start of this before the year end of 2021. So in October, November, we looked at where businesses were just as we were starting to get into the winter months. We helped support those in particular that were open and operational. Next slide. There was also the evaluation of in the selection and the data. We collected information about their forecasts of the businesses. How long did they anticipate being in remaining operational? When will the funding run out? And so that was an important question to analyze. And so we focused our energies in the 3 to 12 months, those two categories kind of in the center, where we were able to concentrate on helping those businesses that had an outlook out beyond 3 months. Next slide. We also collected information about whether they were owners or renters. As noted, as obvious here, the majority were renters. And so the commercial rent relief that this funding would provide was extremely helpful to the business owners. Next slide. We also asked questions about their employees and how many, what their situation was and at the time, and how many employees they had. So many were in the 1 or including themselves, or the 2 to 5 range. We did have businesses that were larger than that, but the majority were below 5 employees. Next slide. We also looked at decline in revenue and how they were impacted by the coronavirus and the situation in our community with the public health. Many of them were between 30 and 75% as far as loss in revenue. And so again, highlighting the importance and the impact that this had for the community, business owners, and being able to stabilize and eventually recover. Next slide. We also asked some information about their workforce. Some had let go of some of their employees, some retained them. Next slide. And then also we wanted to know if they were multiple businesses had multiple locations. And of our applicants, the majority had a single location in the county. Next slide. We also asked a question about discrimination. As I opened, access to capital often is a challenge for minority business owners and founders. This is important to note that yes, this still exists where access to capital, the experience of business owners is that they are majority are discriminated. And so something to keep in note and awareness as we move forward into our economic recovery. Next slide. So I do want to also comment that this widespread economic success does require a diverse ecosystem of small businesses that provide communities with essential services as well as employment and self-determination, as noted. We recognize that business ownership serves a critical driver for our community development, household income stability, and wealth creation. But persistence of exclusionary laws, regulation practices has cemented inequity into our our institutions, so limiting opportunities. Our culture-specific chambers of commerce are an essential lifeline to the economic health of our communities. Together, we advocate for funding and policy frameworks that will help insulate our businesses from economic impacts of future crises and generate conditions and resources that our communities need to thrive in the long term. On behalf of the various culturally specific responsive organizations represented in this report, we want to thank the county for your support enabling for this grant fund program through the federal dollar CARES Acts. As we reviewed in the last few minutes, there are numerous businesses throughout the county, both urban and rural, that were impacted positively by this focus on access to capital and supporting small business founders with economic stabilization and recovery. We appreciate this trust and partnership with you as local government to effect change and providing these grant funds to business founders. We respond to racial disparities and institutionalized inequities with a unified vision, with actionable solutions, shifting power and wealth in ways that build a stronger regional economy. And I'll just add, there were many people involved with this release of funds. We were able to add staff. We needed dedicated staff. As the list for the county shows, we mirrored that in the chambers where we had to have staff dedicated to review applications, help answer questions as they filled the application out. They didn't need to be, they didn't need a CPA to fill out the application, but we had technical assistants and staff to help them with that. So many testimonies that I wasn't able to share with you today of people very grateful and appreciative, business owners, founders, who the combined effort of technical assistance and funding really help them. And as my colleague here mentioned, it saved them. It saved their businesses. So again, thank you. And we look forward to other collaboration efforts that we can have with the county because it's so vital to our stability and recovery. Thank you very much.
And Beth, our next slide, please.
Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Beth Lambert, and I work for MISO. If you're not familiar with our organization, it stands for Micro Enterprise Services of Oregon. I've been with the organization for about 2 years now, working on the community capital team. The agency has one side focused on access to capital and the other focused on business advisory support. I was one of 5 team members who helped with the disbursement of the Multnomah County grant at the end of last year. We dispersed $1.16 million to about 91 recipients. In our case, the grants were distributed to existing MISO clients and small business borrowers who had loan balances. These grants reduced or even forgave their remaining balance. The grant was applied as payments in November and December of 2021. So those who had any remaining balance was paid in full. Those who had a significant allocation of their balance had 2 months of no loan payments, which gave them a little bit of a break. I want to talk a little bit about the approach that MISO took, which I know was really similar to a lot of the other organizations that participated in the disbursement. Our focus was on going above and beyond to break down barriers and make sure that those who were underserved and were maybe missed in earlier rounds of funding received some of the money from this pot. Some of the barriers that we tried to overcome included language, technology, and generally understanding the requirements, which kind of goes back to needing a CPA to get through the applications at points. Examples of ways that we did this was one of our borrowers who's blind was able to take public transit to our office and sit down with our servicing consultant and complete the application in tandem with her so that he was able to get in and receive this funding. Other examples involve a lot of outreach that the staff did to contact our borrowers who we thought might be eligible for this grant and to have conversations with them and make sure that they received some of the many emails that had been sent out about it. Additionally, we provided that TA support, that technical assistance, to make sure that those who had a difficult time providing documentation of their loss in revenue were able to do that through assistance that we provided. The main thing that I want to share with you today are the stories of 3 of our borrowers and clients who received funds from this grant program. The first one I'd like to share with you is Dejaneir Frazier, and his business, DC Rings, received a grant amount of $25,000, which was the maximum amount in this round. His business is a home-based business in Portland. He sells over 100 styles of handcrafted rings made out of glass, and each one is unique. Most of his sales take place on Instagram and at pop-up events when he's able to attend them. He originally borrowed from MISO to purchase a water jet, which would help speed up his production. It made a big difference from crafting each of those individually by hand and being able to create about 10 times as many in the same amount of time. When he received the news that he was receiving a grant of $25,000, he said that it was a breathtaking moment for him. He had a lot of weight on his shoulders, and the release he felt made him want to run around and take off down the street. The water jet equipment that he had taken the loan out for was going to significantly lower his per piece cost for the rings, but due to COVID and supply chain issues, he found out after the loan and his order that there was going to be a 5-month delay. So he was faced with loan payments and no increase in inventory or sales to support them. The grant changed his whole situation and his outlook on it. He was doubting whether he made the right decision for his business at all. After having the Multnomah County grant applied to his balance and having a 2-month break on his payments, he was able to refocus on his business and invest in the foundation of his company. For example, he learned about some of the tax requirements for his business structure. He began looking into getting a trademark on his products. He updated his logo, and he said that he's in the right headspace to build and grow his business rather than focusing on self-doubt. While he knows the future will still have bumps, he said that he's excited about moving forward with a quality product that he can sell. He's focusing on making sure his business structure and products are secure through legal avenues, and then he's focusing on continuing to scale his production. The future for him might hold a warehouse and employees. I asked each of the people that I talked to about the testimony here today whether or not they had a message that they wanted to have conveyed to the board for their experience. And Dejaneir said that he doesn't know if he would have made it without this grant. He wants you to know that your money and what you've offered hasn't gone to waste. And he wants to thank you for having trust in MISO and these other organizations for our work with clients. He appreciates the support and the elevation that's been provided to small businesses. Next, I want to share a little bit about Tawanda Perry, who's a long-term client of MISO. And she received a grant for her business in the amount of $21,000. And the only reason she didn't receive the full $25,000, that was the maximum in this case, is because she had already received a $4,000 grant through NAIA. So she was made whole through that process in a couple of different ways. Tawanda owns a business called Northwest Affordable Autos, which she's had since 2013. It's a used car dealership and a service shop that's located in the Cully neighborhood of Portland. She started out selling cars, of course, but she's since expanded to detailing, towing, selling warranties, and providing vehicle repair. She received a loan through MISO, which she used to purchase tools and equipment for her repair shop. Her initial reaction to the news of receiving this grant was that she felt ecstatic and blessed. She felt like all the hard work she's put in over the years was being rewarded. Having a couple of months without loan payments for her helped them become current on past due bills, invest in equipment such as a generator, and purchase additional car inventory to help increase their revenues. The message that she wanted to have conveyed to you today is that she thinks you did an excellent job of putting money into the community. The timing for her at the end of 2021 was ideal because it came at a later stage of COVID when earlier grants had run out. She said that while she's still not whole from the impact of COVID on her business, that this grant was another lifeline for her. And last but not least, I want to tell you a little bit about David Molina. David received a grant for his business of $25,000. His business is Molina's Construction. They have offices on Southwest Morrison Street, and they do everything from general contracting to demolition and excavation. David is a former Army captain, and he takes pride in giving back to his community through volunteering on the board of Latino Belt and through 2 terms he served on the Oregon Commission on Hispanic Affairs. He received a loan from MISO that he used to purchase a dump truck and an excavator. He said that when he heard the news about the grant, he was also ecstatic, which was a trend we heard, and he got tears in his eyes. The amount he received was unexpected, and the timing was right before the holidays when his revenues were slim. For him, he said that the funds and the break in his payments allowed him to retain some of the employees that he had, which included an office assistant, bookkeeper, and one of his field crew. With the balance on his loan being shaved down, he now has the flexibility to sell his existing excavator and use the money to invest in a bigger machine, as well as pay down some of his business debt. And this morning, I actually got news that David came into our office yesterday and paid the remaining balance, so he's able to move forward with that. The message that he wanted conveyed to you today is that he's incredibly thankful that you selected his business through MISO. He's humbled and he's honored with the investment in his business, but also in the investment in his people and allowing him the ability to pay them through the holidays. So I want to thank you as well. Being a team member that was involved in the distribution of the Multnomah County grant funds was a joyful experience. It was a lot of work for us at the end of the year as well, but every minute of it was joyful because we had the chance to provide some amazing and welcome news and relief to the small business owners who have worked so hard and had such a challenging time during the last 2 years of the pandemic. So I thank you for that experience, and I thank you on behalf of our team and the many clients that were impacted by this.
Thank you so much, Beth. Next slide, please. So that's the end of our presentation. I want to say that it's been an honor to have this role. I just want to echo what Jan and Beth said, that it was a lot of work, but it was an honor to be able to take part in something this important. I know that for so many of us across the county, yourselves included, COVID has really stretched us in unprecedented ways. And all of us wanted to do something to help, and to be in a position to actually help people was a huge privilege. So with that, we'll take any questions.
Oh, thank you so much. So I would like to open it up now for board comments and questions, and I will start with Commissioner Jaipal.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you all so much. Thank you, John, Jan, Beth, Jeff. Where'd you go? There we are. This is just really so exciting to hear about. You know, it took me back on sort of a trip down memory lane, actually, to think about what it was like back in December 2020 and what we were experiencing, and to think about what small businesses were experiencing with all of those changes that are so hard to anticipate and manage. And I'm just struck by what a heavy lift this was, John and Nicole and everybody else who worked on this, to to enter into a line of business that we, the county, was not in before, and to build and maintain relationships that we weren't used to working with in this way, and to do it so quickly under all of these constraints. So I'm just really proud of the work that was done. So appreciative of the partnerships that allowed it to happen. And I'm thinking about the fact that the county doesn't really think of itself as being the line of business development, right? We serve people, individuals. But when we're talking about small businesses, we're talking about an ecosystem that serves those people and supports those people. And when I look at a chart that says that, the majority of these businesses had less than 5 employees, again, this is a way of serving individuals, and entrepreneurship, small businesses are a way of developing income and wealth that many folks, like regular jobs, aren't going to provide it. It's going to be hard for folks to access those. And this is really an alternative avenue. So again, just really appreciative of the work, the thought that went into making sure we were reaching the people that most needed the funds, and these new partnerships that I hope that we can continue to maintain. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Commissioner Vega Peterson.
Thank you, Commissioner. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Cynthia. Thanks. I'm just, Carmen. Thanks, everyone. And John, I have to say, I wanted to just thank you for putting that thank you slide that listed out all of the different employees at Multnomah County who were a part of this work, because it really is a team. And we've heard time and time again during this whole COVID pandemic how important it's been that so many people at the county have responded in the way they did. So I really appreciated you taking the time to do this. And I had a similar experience when you were talking about, like the different, levels that like different counties were at, and the frustration of like having the 2-week pause and what, the uncertainty around that. It really took me back to that time. And I remember, my husband has a small business, and I remember just like him being like on the other side of the wall as we're all working from home, and just the frustration that he had of trying to like go through the PPP loan process and figuring out what documents were needed, and then sending something and finding out that wasn't what was needed. It was such a confusing time for small businesses. And so I'm so glad that Multnomah County, even though it isn't necessarily like what people think of as a core county function, was able to step in and step up, and especially in serving the businesses and the business owners that represent the populations we know that have been so greatly impacted by this. And so I just really appreciate having this opportunity to hear all, really in detailed information about who we were able to serve, what, type of businesses it was, and really hearing the stories about the impacts that it had was just really, it warmed my heart, and it just made me so appreciative of all the work that went into making sure that it happened, because it was a heavy lift and it was a lot to get that money out in a especially with the first round, in a very short time period. So thank you all for that. I did have one question, and I know that both the state, I know that there were limitations on some of how the federal dollars could be used based on immigration status for business owners. And I know that there was some flexibility, like in terms of state funding. And I just wondered what our parameters were for some of the programs that we had.
Yeah, the state laid out, thank you, Commissioner. This is John Bashitinsky. The state laid out really that you had, the minimums that we had in place were that your business had to be in Multnomah County, and that you had to either be registered, depending on the business structure, you had to have a Secretary of State's an active license with the Secretary of State's office. And if you're a sole proprietor, you're allowed to operate just having, your tax ID number, whether that's Social Security number or another kind of ID. So as long as you had that information, you were good to go. We were, and Carmen's here, and along with Hacienda CDC, and I know that we really weren't too concerned. Immigration status was not something that came up. As long as you met those minimum requirements.
Thanks for that. I'm glad to hear that we did have the flexibility in serving, because I know especially in East Portland and East County, we have so many immigrant business owners that were impacted by this as well. So this is wonderful to hear.
Yeah, and the Latinx community was incredibly impacted by COVID. and for all the reasons that you know too well. And it's so having partners like the Hispanic Chamber and Metropolitan Chamber and the Hacienda CDC was invaluable in order to reach that population.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Commissioner Stegman.
Thank you, Commissioner Myron. Great to see and hear from all of you today. Actually, the reason I'm not here in person is because I'll be attending the Travel Portland State of the Industry address, because as you've all mentioned, travel, tourism, businesses, small businesses, we rely on industry to help support our tax base. And as has been mentioned, we do not have an economic development department. So John, I really want to thank you and Jeff for stepping up, although I do believe that is something that we definitely need to think about standing up, just for all of the very reasons that Jan and Beth have mentioned. So I did want to also recognize my Chief of Staff, Rebecca Stavengard. She was instrumental in getting $1 million out the door. I know that there were many nights that she was up well past midnight, not only crafting the application to make it simple, to make it streamlined, but as well as reviewing the applications, working with jurisdictional partners, Gresham, Fairview, Troutdale, Wood Village, and the city of Portland. So this really was a big lift by everybody coming together. And I so appreciate you all highlighting the different industries. As we know, restaurants and food carts, retail, construction, beauty salons, all of those small business owners were completely devastated during the pandemic. And providing economic relief isn't something that the county does, but I think that we should in the future, and we definitely need to be talking more about it. And then, I loved hearing the stories about individual business owners. Beth, thank you, the DC Rings, about the $25,000 grant. As a small business owner myself, a minority-owned business, like I live this every day, so I know how important it is. And sometimes people think that because you're a small business owner, you're independently wealthy. I can attest to that fact that we are not. Many of us are just, small mom and pop, maybe 1 or 2 employees. And interestingly, the Small Business Development said that 99.9% of businesses in the United States are small businesses. So we are a huge driver to economic development and economic stability. And so it's just so important that the county was able to rally and step in and save and encourage many of those businesses to go on quite literally in some of their darkest moments. So, and finally, I just want to thank Jan and Beth for all of your leadership around the community chambers, how you all joined together to get the money out the door in a record historic amount of time. And I know that many small business owners, frankly, wouldn't be here, and many have had to leave their businesses. But because of the work that you all did, you made a huge difference in a lot of people's lives. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I too just want to express my gratitude for all of the work done by all of you and so many others over the past couple of years. And I too appreciated that slide, John, of like the listing out of so many people. And so thank you very, very much. I have a couple of questions, and these are sort of little bit looking to the future. And the first question is about, now that we're in this period where, who knows, I hesitate to even say anything, out loud, but as we are moving toward recovery out of COVID, but who knows, how are we staying in contact, continuing to follow up with the businesses that we have supported to ensure that they are continuing to do well, check in, see what they need. And this might tie some to Commissioner Stegman's question about, where will this live? Where will this work live now that, John, you are sadly stepping back into your day job and your other day job and doing all of that work?
Maybe I'll let Beth or Jan or even Carmen if you want to.
I can start. For the chambers, many of us automatically give them memberships to our chamber. And so this is how we try to stay in touch, to also let them know about other programming activities that are happening within the chamber, technical assistance. Several of us have through the state programs, technical assistance programs. And so that ongoing relationship with them and keeping in close communication, we're starting to meet in person like we are today. So networking is something that chambers typically do. And so we're coming up, May has quite a few activities. We were just talking about one that Carmen has with the HMSC and their scholarship luncheon, and it's API Leadership Month. So we take these moments to not just invite them to gather, but also to celebrate them. And so we use those gatherings to stay in touch. While that may not seem like a direct way that we're doing it, but it is a way that we stay in touch by making sure they're invited, asking them how they're doing, how their business is doing, how their families are doing. We're a tight community when it comes to the culturally specific community. And so there are many gatherings where we also learn about how their businesses are doing. So this is how that ecosystem of businesses, and I think that would be probably the difference of your typical place-based chambers. And that's, I think, something that's innate and just natural with a lot of our culture, gathering, food, and hugs, and obviously social distancing where we can, and as much as possible, and following the guidelines that our health department has provided. So I just feel like that's this next stage, as to you're pointing out, as we get into more in person, this is how we stay in touch. And then just direct communication with one-on-ones.
To follow up on that, I would say at MISO, the grant recipients in our case were maybe unusual because they're all existing MISO clients. And our clients are usually either, and not always one or the other, but usually either borrowers who are getting loans through MISO, and or they are in our long-term or our short-term business development programs. So a lot of the recipients in this case are working with our business development team. So they have an advisor that they meet with on a regular basis, that they work with on their business strategy and on their financials and on their marketing and all of those different things. So there's a very close relationship there. For those who aren't in those programs, we do keep in touch with everybody in the loan portfolio. So we're generally reaching out to some of them more often than others. And our loan servicer, Tammy, who was instrumental in the distribution of these funds, is in contact with almost all of our borrowers on a very regular basis, either answering questions, making payments, or directing them towards resources that they might have questions about.
Great, thank you.
And then
Hello.
Carmen, do you want to?
Great to see you.
Carmen Castro, Executive Director for the Hispanic Metropolitan Chamber. To echo some of this, some of the folks to receive loans, we decided to enroll into our technical assistance program because they recognized they needed additional support. And we were fortunately to be able to make room for them. And some others we are keeping maybe less intense in touch with them, but they are invited and they're part of our list to participate in our complimentary free workshops that we have twice a month. And I would suggest that perhaps when there is another round, that there is another smaller one to keep those networks together. Because this follow-up would, would help with, excuse me here, continued success and to assess those needs. So it's not just a one-time thing, but rather something has a longer arc and supports these business. So it creates that ecosystem that you mentioned.
And I'll just add a couple of quick notes that, between the investments that Prosper Portland made and that the county made, I think we've helped to strengthen, especially some of our community chamber partners, which is, obviously has a lot of ripple knock-on positive effects. And when it comes to the county, besides dollars, the most valuable resource we had was information, especially during the height of the pandemic. And so Jessica Guernsey, our public health director, Dr. Vines, made themselves available to talk to business associations and tell them what the data was showing, what we were seeing in terms of disease progression in the community, why certain public health measures were in place, what we can anticipate changing. And so that was really invaluable. And then one final sort of note is, the county, we're a big organization. We can kind of look like a monolith from the outside. So having someone that you can contact to be a catalyst to connect you to either the resources or the individuals that you want to talk to is really valuable. And so, I've been pleased to be able to play that role for associations and individual businesses.
Well, I love that. I think all of you have spoken to exactly what I have been thinking about, just from everything you've talked about today, the stories you've told, the information that you've shared. And, I love the description of an ecosystem is perfect. And I guess my question, and again, bringing back Commissioner Stegman's point into this, is how to sort of formalize something at the county. I'm just thinking out loud, so that as we are moving forward, that we do not lose all of the incredible networks that have been created during this time, and that we have an ongoing sustainability to help foster, support all of the organizations and allow you to thrive and leverage the resources in the optimal way moving forward. So anyway, it is so wonderful to hear from you, and I love the HMSC scholarship lunch, and it is always such a joyous event. So that's very exciting too. And I guess just thanks to all of you for all that you do. Oh, and I'm okay. So thank you. We're going to move on to our next briefing, which is on the COVID pandemic.
Morning.
Hello. So nice to see you. I don't know. Do I need?
Are we okay to go?
You
Go ahead.
are so okay. You may go ahead. The informational briefing on COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes, fortuitously after the previous presentation, big thanks to everybody who just presented on that amazing, important work for our business community. Good morning. I'm Jessica Guernsey, Public Health Director. I use she, her, hers pronouns.
Oh, and good morning, Dr. Jennifer Vines, your Multnomah County Health Officer, she, her pronouns.
And we're here today to do our routine COVID briefing. I do want to acknowledge before we get started that we are at a pivot moment, real time in our community, as I'm sure many folks know. So today we're going to talk about our routine data, where we are with our vaccination rates, and then talk a little bit about our framework moving forward in terms of the inevitable waves we're going to see as COVID continues. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Vines for our data overview.
Could have the next slide. Yeah, perfect. Next slide. And the next one. Okay. Great. So good morning, Commissioners. It's really nice to be with you. These slides are going to look very familiar, but I'm actually going to fill out with more of the reality of what's actually happening, and that's based on what we're hearing and seeing from community members and from different liaisons. This is our testing percent positivity. You can see it's trending up into the worrisome range between 5 and 10%. What's actually also really notable is the light blue bars is the total volume of testing. And again, these are test reports that are being formally reported to public health. But you can see how the bars have really dropped. So the lower the testing volume that comes to us gets, sort of the more wobbly that test percent positive can be, because the numerator and denominator get a bit unstable. So again, looking at trends, this certainly mirrors trends that we're seeing elsewhere. Next slide, please. So again, these are just cases for Multnomah County. You can see the upswing there. I think if you're like me or Jessica, you're sort of feeling like everyone is saying they have COVID or know someone who has COVID at this moment. We're certainly hearing that from schools. So I don't pretend that this graph includes, again, the universe of COVID testing. This is what gets formally reported through public health channels. I think now that home tests are more widely available, this is how we're having more of this experience that's not necessarily reflected in the numbers, or at least questionable in the numbers, about how much of an uptick we're seeing. And certainly the situation in schools reflects community transmission. So we are seeing an uptick in school outbreaks and cases there, almost certainly fueled by spread in the community, which is a reality now that the Omicron BA.2 variant is the majority. So we remain in essentially 100% Omicron, but majority BA.2 variant. And if you remember, this is the variant that actually spreads even faster than the original Omicron, but is widely believed to be, again, on the milder spectrum of disease, and certainly not as much of a threat to people who have had Omicron infection and who are fully vaccinated and boosted. Next slide, please. This is what some consider the purest indicator of COVID. These are COVID-19 hospitalizations. Again, we can parse hospitalized with COVID if it's super common in the community versus hospitalized for COVID, which means you're actually there for COVID complications, because there's always a severe end of the disease spectrum, even if overall it's mild. So you can see that hospitalizations remain relatively low and flat. Again, though, in the context of increasing disease numbers, which puts us in this Center for Disease Control medium risk category or yellow category, we start to think about keeping high risk individuals out of the hospital for COVID. And so this is not sort of public health coming in with mask mandates for everybody. This is putting the community on alert that cases are going up. We don't want to see medically fragile individuals hospitalized or sick with this virus. And so we go back to what we know works, and that includes masking. That means double checking that you're up to date with your COVID vaccine. And for those who are high risk, or for those who care about them, making sure they know what symptoms to watch for, have access to testing, and have a plan to get antivirals, which are increasingly available and actually quite good at lowering the risk of hospitalization in someone who has symptoms of COVID and would otherwise be at high risk for complications. So again, hospitals they're busy. They have plenty of backlogged care, unfortunately, to tend to. So they are certainly not overwhelmed by COVID or close to being overwhelmed by COVID. But there is the concern about what we can do to prevent these hospitalizations for the sake of those individuals. And again, knowing that our healthcare providers are in their own stage of recovery. Next slide, please. I think this is where I turn it to Jessica. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you want us to pause for any questions? Good. Okay. So I'm just going to review our routine vaccination numbers. Next slide, please. This is our biweekly update of the clinics that we're hosting either directly or in partnership. All of this information is on our website, so we are continuing to offer low barrier community-based clinics. And we have seen a little bit of an uptake in vaccination demand, not nearly what we were at before, but with each variant, we definitely see folks coming in for their first doses or booster. Next slide, please. So this is the very difficult to read graph that gives an overall breakdown of our race ethnicity coverage for any dose of COVID-19 vaccine across the state. So for Multnomah County, just to review our numbers, For American Indian, Alaskan Native communities, we are about 78%. Asian communities, 86%. Black African American, 78%. Latinx communities, 67%. Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities, 99%. And then white communities, 88%. And again, this is for any, for one dose or more for all vaccinations for communities. And as you probably recall, quite a while ago, our sort of gold bar was 80%. So we're pretty close or above in most communities. We still have some work to go to close those gaps. And as Dr. Vines mentioned, you're going to hear us continue to say, get vaccinated, make sure you're current with your vaccinations and your boosters as a means to prevent the worst outcomes of this virus. Next slide, please. So just in sheer volume, this is again the numbers that we have received and either utilized in our community clinics or redistributed. So we've received a total of almost 184,000 COVID vaccines. About 168,000 have been redistributed to reach high-risk individuals through partner agencies. Next slide, please. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to ask everybody to bear with us as we talk through this pivot point that we're at right now, because I know it is a little bit confusing compared to where we were previously. So we've spent quite a bit of time in public health, both internally and externally, talking about, where are we going with this? Obviously, we're going to be living with this virus for a very long time. Unfortunately, we're going to go through ebbs and flows like we are right now. So it is, again, fortuitous that we're in front of you today to talk through this. So we've really taken some time to pull in all the public health expertise, our community partnership expertise, to talk about how are we really going to know where we're at. As you all know, the CDC has a set of metrics and categories, low, medium, and high. Today, we were moved into the medium category, so we have shifted based on our case numbers and our hospitalizations. But those numbers are somewhat crude, and most of the time we're hearing things in the community, as Dr. Vines mentioned, that gives us an indicator of what's happening even before those numbers are showing up. So we're going to talk through really what we're using real time to help understand what's going on. And I really want to give kudos to everybody in our public health division, the health officer unit, all of the work across our community partnership unit, external community-based agencies. As I mentioned before, we took a little bit more time to talk this through, to figure out how we wanted to do this and make sure we have the structures set up to have especially two-way dialogue with community to understand what people are seeing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So I really want to give kudos to everybody on our team that spent so much time working on this. Next slide. Sorry. So just a little bit more information on where we're at. As you all know from the data that Dr. Vines just presented, we have robust data collection at the local level. We're really fortunate to have an absolutely stellar epidemiological team that goes above and beyond local public health data analysis. So we are continuing to rely on much of that data analysis at a local level so that we understand what's going on, particularly when new variants emerge, as we're in right now. So it takes a few minutes to understand what's going on. And I know this has been frustrating for everyone in the community. We know what's going on when it's going on. We see a variant emerge and we're understanding how severe it is. Has it changed in its nature in terms of vaccine breakthrough capability? Is it affecting a different age group? Is it spreading faster? All of this we're learning real time, and we're having to modify our interventions and messages. So that, I know, like I said, can be frustrating, but that is what we're looking at right now with this particular variant, and it's why you'll start to see the messaging shift actually starting today. So as I mentioned, the CDC has moved us into the medium category, and the messaging will shift in a slightly nuanced way. But I think it's important today and hopefully this week with more messaging as we push out, it's important that folks listen to trusted messengers and understand what's going on in real time. because we are going to have to shift as we're seeing things change. So what we're looking at is moving more towards recommendations and away from mandates. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But one thing that I really want to emphasize today is we should not be waiting for mandates to understand what's going on and shift our behavior based on risk. Does that make sense? Okay. Next slide, please. So this is a high-level graphic of where we are today, what we're moving towards to emphasize, and what we could recommend in the future. And this is similar to what you'll see on the CDC website. And as I mentioned, we'll start to shift this messaging today. And then at the very far end, you're also going to see really what we're most likely not going to be doing. I do want to say that if there's anything that we've learned from COVID, it does throw us curveballs. We think we may know everything, but we don't. So things change. So we have to be prepared. So, just to the last briefing, obviously, when we were in 2020, that was a very different time. We had a window of opportunity to flatten the curve and slow things down using very blunt tools like closures that really, for the most part, are going to be off the table unless there is a situation that emerges that really requires that level of intervention. But for the most part, where we've been going is sort of ramping down and again, away from mandates and really amplifying public health recommendations. So where we are right now, again, we're in a recommendations category. We are going to be amplifying messages this week. You'll see much more of a focus on, as Dr. Vines mentioned, individuals or people that care for individuals or are around individuals that are high risk or immunocompromised. We'll be amplifying messaging about considering indoor masking, considering talking to a healthcare provider to ensure folks have access to testing and a pathway to the effective treatments to treat the worst outcomes of COVID. It's a modest shift in messaging, but that is what we were going to see incrementally over time. Just in terms of our public health response, again, as Dr. Vines mentioned, we are starting to see and hear all of this information based on the way we're set up to monitor quantitative and qualitative data. So we're seeing that uptick in our data, although it's not complete in the testing data because of at-home testing. And then we are also hearing from community partners like schools that they are seeing additional cases and percentages of students and faculty out. Next slide, please. So again, this just goes through more what our routine data monitoring includes, testing volume and percent positivity, looking at emergency room and urgent care diagnosis, understanding our case numbers and any disparities that we're seeing in racial, ethnic demographics, keeping a very close eye on vaccine breakthrough cases and looking at national literature around any reduced coverage or impact of the vaccines. Obviously, our hospitalizations and deaths, our vaccine and booster rates, and then our outbreak types and sizes. So again, this is routine data that we have always looked at and will continue to look at. Next slide. And then this is just the framework that we've talked about before that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention uses to determine whether we are in low, medium, or high. So as I mentioned, we've moved into the medium range for COVID, and this includes the 3 indicators: new COVID-19 admissions per 100,000 population in the past 7 days, percent of staffed inpatient beds occupied by COVID-19 patients, and the total new cases per 100,000 population in the past 7 days. Next slide. And then I pretty much went over this, but just to mention again, local data that we look at very carefully to understand a little bit more what's happening on the ground that'll inform real-time actions even before perhaps there's a change in the CDC level, includes our vaccine effectiveness studies in adults and children, the severity of illness in the people hospitalized with COVID-19. Also, again, looking at the how the vaccines are interacting. Genetic sequencing to understand outbreak transmission, and this is really done by OHSU. We don't do it directly, but we're in direct conversations with them to understand that. And then, as I mentioned, changes in transmission rates, specifically looking at demographics such as age and race and ethnicity. Next slide. So the big ad that we've really solidified in the last 2 years, which was actually noted in the previous presentation in terms of our work with the chambers of commerce and many different business organizations, is really a much more robust qualitative understanding and real-time connection with community. So as I mentioned, we have been talking to the schools for the last few weeks, really seeing an uptick in what's happening in our local community. But really, this is the on-the-ground information that may not show up in the data set, but we're going to hear about it first. So keeping these channels of communication open and vital is key to understanding what's happening locally. So some of the issues that we've already heard that people, have a pulse on, not that it's happening right now, but these are the kinds of things that folks are reporting back to us, include ideas about sites of high transmission, barriers to testing and access to care, which you all probably remember over the last 2 years. We definitely got that information directly from community. Protective and risky changes in behavior, motivation and obstacles to behavior change. And something like that could include access to masks or access to home test kits. And then understanding the meaning and relevance of disease experience and what data tells us. So I think you all have heard me many times before talk about data meaning making. This is a feedback loop that we have, and we are building more capacity for across the community to look at what we're seeing in our quantitative data and make meaning of it with community to make sure that we're understanding what's happening on the ground correctly. Next slide, please. And then just a little bit more about the community pathways. You all have heard from community health workers, community-based agencies throughout the last 2 years here at the board briefings. And those are some of the most important two-way conversations that we're having to understand what's happening on the ground. We have structures set up where our epidemiologists are routinely meeting with our community partnership units and external partners, again, to do that data meaning making and understand what's happening on the ground. We have maintained a strong capability with our liaison work in our communicable disease unit to make sure we have connections with businesses, faith communities, and other sectors. We do that work anyway outside of COVID, but really COVID brought to light how important it is to have that capacity. We have outreach teams in our communicable disease unit that routinely engage with sectors like private gyms and studios, salons, and other culturally specific businesses and communities, again, to understand what's happening on the ground. And then, of course, we have a team that directly works with the schools. We're meeting with the schools multiple times a week. This is a specific setting that obviously we want to pay close attention to and support. And then we have other pathways that we've engaged over the last 2 years, doing just general community listening sessions and then surveys occasionally to gather other information. Next slide, please. One thing that I didn't mention that I wanted to say about this framework and the way we're looking at our indicators and also how we shift our messaging and guidance in the community is that this is, well, it probably goes without saying, it's iterative. We're going to learn as we go, which means we may need to add additional both indicators and interventions. So as I mentioned, our public health teams did quite a bit of work in brainstorming around what are some other things that we can add over time that will help us understand what's going on. So this is just a laundry list of things that we're going to be looking at adding over the next few months. All of this requires staff to do it and intense work to get it off the ground and make sure it's functioning. But these are other things that we can and will look at to understand the patterns in the community. Next slide. And I think that's the end of our presentation. We'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, as always, for the presentation and the work that you and your teams continue to do. So for board comments and questions, I will start with Commissioner Stegman.
Thank you.
There you are.
Thank you, Commissioner Myron. I don't really have any questions, but again, just thank you to Jessica and Dr. Vines for their continued leadership through a pandemic. And I did want to talk about as we move from mandates to recommendations. I think that is a relief to a lot of individuals. So just wanted to thank you for your leadership and don't really have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Vega Peterson.
Thank you. Thanks you guys for this update. It does seem incredibly timely to have it now as everybody's more aware of more cases happening. I think, like you said, everybody's hearing about somebody, or I'm getting, more notices from my kids' school about cases happening. I had a couple of questions. So I appreciated the slide that looked at all of the different, like the data analysis that happen locally, and really the quantitative indicators, COVID indicators that you look at. Is kind of I'm imagining it's kind of like a mix of art and science, and using those different quantitative indicators to decide on the policies. And it really is like a mix across the board. It's not just hospitalizations. I'm just curious a little bit about how that works.
Yeah, it's definitely an art and a science. I can speak to how I see it and invite Dr. Vines to comment as well. It's, for example, right now, we are seeing a variant that appears to be less severe. It seems to be spreading very quickly. So looking at those different indicators altogether is going to inform a shift in an upgrade or a downgrade in terms of our messaging. We have structures in place where we're looking at that as a team altogether in different venues. And then we have a complementary sort of group that brings together the quantitative and the qualitative to make sure we're ground truthing what it is we're seeing and hearing, and that we have lots of opportunities to catch red flags. Unfortunately, we will never be at a point that we're going to have a matrix that spits out like sort of an automatic set of recommendations based on data. It is going to be real time. But I do feel very confident that what we want to emphasize is that we will amplify recommendations based on what we're seeing. And please do not wait for a mandate. We know that masks work. For example, you'll notice I'm wearing a mask today. So we know that masks work. We know that vaccines will decrease the likelihood of hospitalizations. We also know that communities have been incredibly creative, businesses, schools, in modifying how we do our routine business across all sectors to prevent the spread of many respiratory illnesses, not just COVID. And we're really encouraging folks to continue those things that help really reduce the spread. So to your question, it is not an exact science, so to speak, and we really have to look at things carefully. We also have to look at the costs of what it is we're recommending.
I appreciate that, and appreciate all the kind of work and discussion that goes into making sure that what the data is telling you to do, and I think you guys have such great experience now doing that, and we've got some great folks on our public health team who are working with that, along with all the partners like OHSU and others. Are there any, the question of at-home tests and at-home testing is such an interesting one, because right now, in Oregon, we don't use it to track data. Are there any conversations about how at-home tests should be used or could be used in terms of tracking this? Or is it just such a, is it just so hard to track, or just so hard to get any reliable, data on that? I'm just curious about those conversations, because I took one on Sunday, which was negative, but people I think are using them now that they're more readily available more often.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
I know, yeah. So I know that Oregon Health Authority, I believe, still has an option where people can voluntarily report their home test result. So they will say that almost all of their data is based on lab reported results, but there's probably a small handful of reported home tests. Unfortunately, I don't think there's been any serious consideration given to how to easily capture just the volume of home tests, why people test, is it because you have symptoms? Is it because you're a contact? Just tests is helpful, but we don't have an easy way to actually capture that. And then beyond that, it's also really nice to know how people are using the test so we can like, more fully interpret what it is we're getting.
So it doesn't sound something like that would be happening anytime soon.
Not anytime soon.
Okay. I appreciate all of that. And I think that was the main questions that I had. Just appreciate the update on this. And I don't know. And I think this was something like the news came out and it got like almost zero attention, but I think the state's COVID vaccination, application is now available. And, I think that's also interesting to see what the uptake of that is going to be, especially around businesses. But for, folks who are interested, they have the app now that people can have their vaccination proof. And I know there's limitations to that, to the application, unfortunately, but I just thought that, especially as we're looking at rising cases, that is something that people should be aware of.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Jayapal.
Commissioner Myron, thank you so much, as always. It is just a really interesting point in this. And I guess I have a couple of questions. One is, still along that art science spectrum, that the chart of the framework, interventions where we are now, if virus intensifies and then significant change only. So I'm curious, like, the third column says could recommend if there's a significant increase. And then the fourth column says will not recommend unless virus transmission disease changes significantly. I feel like there's some sort of qualitative distinction between significant increase and virus transmission disease changes significantly.
Right.
Could you talk about that?
Sure. For me, probably one of the biggest indicators would be some sort of significant reduced efficacy of the vaccine with a variant. That would be of extreme concern. So that's one for me that comes to mind immediately. Jen, I don't know if you.
So we brainstorm our catastrophic ideas, which would be a version of COVID that gets completely around vaccine and basically sets us back to 2020. A version of COVID that is more severe in children, where we have essentially no hospital surge capacity, and I think would be a game changer in people's hearts and minds. So those are just a couple of ideas that we came up with for that far right column.
That's really helpful, because I think what you're saying is it's not about the trend line going up. If the trend line's going up, we're still in that third column really until some undefined point.
Right.
But it's a change in kind of how the virus is being transmitted or how our other protections are working.
Yep.
Okay, that's helpful. And then a question about use, and I'm not young children, but I'm talking about sort of teenagers, college age students. We are reading that universities on the East Coast, for example, are reintroducing mask mandates because they're seeing an uptick. I've had a couple of meetings recently, for example, with folks working in the sex trafficking space, talking about really seeing the kids, the young people they're serving, not able to get jobs or other things because the vaccine uptake is low. So combination of trends, that's what we're seeing university, and then low vaccine uptake is what some folks are seeing. So I'm curious about whether we are engaging in some sort of specific campaign or messaging or anything targeting that group, that age group.
Yeah, we have done, we had a youth group for a while, sort of teenage to young adult group that helped us really do some amplification of messages through the course of the last 2 years. We also, as you know, have worked with the schools and school-based health centers quite a bit to really promote easy access to vaccination, not just for youth in school, but also family members. But that has been an area that you've probably seen, not only teenagers and young adults, but younger folks that are eligible for the vaccine. There's been fairly slow uptake, which we sort of knew was going to happen based on the emergency use authorization. And I would say perhaps a little bit more hesitancy and reviewing the data and understanding what that meant for young people as opposed to adults, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I know we've been working closely with schools all along, so I am thinking about that slightly older college age group where we have this combination of trend going up and vaccine uptake low.
Right.
And the need to focus some attention there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we're always going to be pushing that out and looking to expand our partnerships and trying to increase the uptake. I think some of the strategies that we considered before, aren't necessarily going to be applicable now. So it's a little bit of a challenge. But we are going to continue to do that.
And then a quick question about antivirals. What is the supply like, and is access to those restricted to particular groups? Where do you see that going?
Yeah, so supply is still somewhat restricted. It's on what we call allocation, where many of the pills come through the state to be doled out according to a framework that they established that prioritizes federally qualified health centers. So the Multnomah County primary care clinics have access. I'm hearing from community providers that they have it on hand. There are routes to partner with pharmacies in order to be able to connect, do the prescription and then connect the patient to pharmacies same day. It is not perfect. And we expect supply to increase. We're trying to encourage as many streamlined pathways as we can. But the reality is the antivirals have to be started within 5 days of symptom onset. So that means someone has to get sick, get a test, connect to a provider, be assessed, and then start taking the medicine. So I don't think it's perfect, but it's coming along, and we are trying to use all the channels that we have in public health to influence that clinical practice.
Great. I think that's little understood. I don't hear people talking about antivirals, and but it's good to know that there are pathways and that hopefully that supply will increase.
Well, and you'll definitely notice on our matrix that is included as like an area of amplification of message that we're engaging in right now because of the efficacy. And to your point, people don't know as much about it as they do like the vaccine. It hasn't been discussed as much. So people have a lot of questions. What is it? How do I get it? So actually our team met this morning with the FQHC to understand and make sure the pathway that we've carved out to fill any gaps is standing up and working. And what we're hearing from the community, again, that two-way street of understanding, not just like, what are we seeing in our data, but what are we hearing from community partners about? Do they know about this? Are they able to access it?
And I will just add that there's some really interesting, at least one sort of niche product called Evusheld, which is actually an injection that is protective before COVID infection, but it's recommended for a very narrow group of highly immunosuppressed patients. So that's actually, the state's actually working directly with the healthcare providers who care for that very small group of really immunosuppressed individuals. But that's how we keep people out of the hospital, is connecting high-risk patients like that to some of these newer pharmaceuticals.
And that's not a vaccine. It
is not a vaccine. It is a protective injection that you give, not in response to infection, but ahead of the infection to protect someone who is high risk.
Well, it's encouraging to know that that's something new. Hadn't heard about that. So that's great. Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you both. A lot of sort of my questions were covered. The one sort of remaining question, and we could also talk about this offline, is I think all of my fellow commissioners may have touched on this, but I guess my question is, what would the downside be to just strongly recommending indoor masking now, like moving into that fourth column instead of, or whichever column it was on that list? It said that if there's that significant uptick, that would be the next, like, why would we not just do that now, since it is a recommendation? Maybe that could avoid some of the significant transmission, and then it would also leave opportunity for a mask mandate to be the next step, rather than like at the end with closures and all of that draconian stuff. So is there a downside to having it?
I can give you my opinion.
Yeah.
Being both a public health practitioner and a community member, and trying to apply all this in my personal life on multiple tiers as well as in my professional life. I think there is real fatigue, and I think we need to measure our level of recommendation proportionate to what we're seeing. Again, COVID, we are in a serious situation in that we are seeing an uptick, and certainly people could be at more elevated risk. And I will say that long COVID is nothing to shake a stick at, so to speak. People who are experiencing long COVID, who maybe were not hospitalized. If you know anyone, it's definitely something to contend with that impacts your entire life. That being said, I think we're trying to use very measured recommendations in the environment that we're in right now with some level of fatigue. And honestly, I am looking to the fall and thinking there may be a time that more extreme measures are needed, even on a recommendation spectrum. That's my opinion.
And I would second that, recommend versus strongly recommend, that's reasonable. People can disagree about where we should be at this moment in time. I do want to echo this notion that we're somehow like not acknowledging long COVID. Long COVID is absolutely real. And I take it seriously, but I also have to be just really honest with people about what I know about this particular virus that's circulating right now. It is very, very contagious, and it is just very easy to spread from person to person. And if you look at the zero COVID strategy, I mean, look to the headlines out of China, which are like pretty incredible, what they're actually doing to their population in the name of preventing infections as opposed to preventing complications. So I think, again, it's the art and the science piece. I'm with Jessica philosophically that we need to really carefully calibrate the language that we use according to the risk that we see and understand as best we know it at the time.
Well, thank you both again for your work, for your presentation, and to your teams. All right, so there is one more item that just wanted to call out and ask fellow commissioners if they would like to comment because it is so significant. And the board will be sending out a joint statement today on the Supreme Court's decision or opinion, that the draft opinion that has come out. But I wanted to offer the opportunity for individual board members to comment on that situation. And so Commissioner Jayapal.
Thank you, Commissioner Myron. I think we were all startled and not startled to read that opinion. We knew it was coming, but it's still a different thing to actually see it. Justices who stated in sworn testimony that Roe versus Wade was established precedent have voted to overturn it. We knew this day was coming, and it is here. They've rolled the clock backward to a time when women did not have autonomy over their bodies, the right to freely make the most personal of decisions, whether to carry a pregnancy to term and bear a child, the right to choose themselves. We must do everything we can to support women in places where abortion will no longer be available, and to support the providers who will come under threat even in those places where it is available. We must do everything in our power to ensure that Oregon remains one of those places where abortion is freely available. And I think we have to recognize that this rollback of rights doesn't stop here. It's part of an agenda, a continuing agenda that includes the cruel and unjust policies we see targeting transgender people, and an agenda that I believe will target other rights included in the right to privacy guaranteed by Roe versus Wade, including the right to contraception and marriage equality. This board has previously taken bold action on issues like this, and we need to be as bold as possible again. Our scope for policy action on abortion isn't broad, but Commissioner Vega-Peterson and my offices have been meeting with advocates to brainstorm what we can do. Short of board action, what we can do is continue to speak out, to share our stories, and to advocate. Thank you, Commissioner Myron, for raising this and providing time.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Stegman.
Thank you, Commissioner Myron. Yesterday, a very troubling opinion was shared from the Supreme Court that would strike down federal protection of abortion rights. Right now, there are people across the country who are in fear and who are concerned about their personal health and safety. There are states in our nation that are poised to make abortion illegal the moment a definitive statement is issued from the Supreme Court. But there are also states hurrying to codify their own local legislation to protect a person's right to choose. This news is unsettling for so many, and I join you in your anger and fear. In Oregon, we are fortunate to have protections in place for those who are seeking abortion care. But I know that in other states, this decision would disproportionately impact people of color and low-income community members. They may not be able to travel to another state and may be forced to rely on unsafe procedures, which will further endanger their health and well-being. It is the responsibility of the Supreme Court to protect our federal rights. The right to an abortion is an established precedent, and the bottom line is that we have the right to choose what we do with our own bodies, period. I urge Congress to end the filibuster, codify Roe versus Wade, and expand the Supreme Court now. Thank you, Commissioner Myron.
Thank you. Commissioner Vega Peterson.
Thank you. So about 5:45 last night, my phone started blowing up with text, with messages from friends, from the women I serve on the board of Pro-Choice Oregon with. I started something to my family about this decision, this news about the leak of the Supreme Court draft decision. And this is something that from the second that Mitch McConnell refused to appoint Merrick Garland as President Obama's Supreme Court nominee, I dreaded this day happening. And I am heartbroken that the United States Supreme Court is on the precipice of abolishing the right of a person to make such fundamental decisions about their own body. And I am furious that in this country that I love, the right that I've had to make decisions about when and if to become a mother is something that my daughter might only have if she lives in the right state. But I know, and I am absolutely certain, that we will not let this happen quietly. We know that when abortion rights are limited, it is young women, poor women, Black and brown women who bear the brunt of these kinds of limitations. We need to support organizations that are allowing women access to abortions in states where it's legal. And we know that together we collectively have to march, we have to fight, and we have to elect people into office who are going to pass a federal law to protect the right to have an abortion for every person who can bear children in this country. Thank you.
Thank you. And I too, I was outraged and horrified, but sadly not surprised to, when I first heard of and read the draft SCOTUS Supreme Court opinion. This has felt like a ticking time bomb, which has now exploded, and the shrapnel is landing in every community throughout our country. As medical director with the Oregon Foundation for Reproductive Health, I fought for years for abortion as part of our public health continuum. In the ER, as a healthcare provider, I've cared for individuals who have been devastated by unwanted pregnancy or complications and counseled them about their full range of healthcare options, including abortion. I've performed abortion services. As a county commissioner, I've championed policies that support reproductive health and justice for all people, particularly those who are most vulnerable and marginalized and will be most impacted by this opinion. And as a mother, I fought for my children's healthcare rights. The Supreme Court opinion pierces the heart of freedom and justice in our country. It is not acceptable. I will stand up with my fellow commissioners and fight for the rights of all people to make decisions about their own bodies, healthcare providers to help people make those decisions that are right for them, and the organizations that support and advocate and champion this work. Abortion is healthcare, and healthcare is a human right. Thank you. And there will be a joint statement that will be released. And with that, no further business. Our meeting is adjourned. Our next meeting is Thursday.